Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Erica Hirschler, Kroll Senior Curator of American Paintings here at the MFA, and it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you here this afternoon. I'd like to begin by thanking the contributors who made this program possible, MFA trustee Tim Phillips and an anonymous donor whose generous gifts have enabled us to fulfill one of the really most important tenets of the museum's strategic plan, engaging deeply. And I think we'll be able to do that together today. I know that we're going to share a stimulating and life-affirming afternoon, our energies inspired by the art of Hyman Bloom. And we're grateful to many people for their generosity in making this exhibition and its associated programming possible. But today I especially want to thank and recognize Stella Bloom, who's here with us in the audience today, who has been such a tireless champion for her husband's work and who has opened the eyes of so many, including mine, and I am delighted to welcome her here today. Before I introduce all of our presenters, I wanted to share just a couple of thoughts about today's topic, Hyman Bloom, Spirituality and Art. Some of you may have attended our program last November, Hyman Bloom, Art, Medicine, and the Body. That discussion really focused on the physical aspects of Bloom's art, and today we're going to focus on its spiritual aspects. But to me, these qualities, physical and spiritual, material and ephemeral, are inextricably linked. That's one of the reasons I find the artist's work so compelling. The paradox, as Bloom himself put it, of, and I quote, the harrowing and the beautiful. Our exhibition is a very focused presentation of a singular motif in Bloom's art, his interest throughout his long career in the human form and in matters of life and death. Bloom sought to understand the meaning of life by getting beneath the surface of things. He saw the bodies he painted as stages in a continuous cycle of existence, culminating perhaps in their roles as incubators of new life forms or as vessels to the spirit. Life is not just what we experience on Earth, he said. You don't just die and rot away. That would tell us that life is trivial, and that wouldn't make sense. Nature has a way of carrying on. Bloom, with his deep interest in Eastern philosophy, was unafraid to confront the end of life, commenting that his paintings were, quote, emblems of metamorphosis. From one form of life inevitably came another, he added, for the living organisms which inhabit the body in death transform it into life in another form. Bloom painted and drew for decades, and while the corpses and anatomy lessons continued to stir his imagination, they were far from the only subjects that he explored throughout his life. His fascination continued with other favored themes as well. Rabbis bent with the weight of wisdom. Fishes as skeletons or toothy living specimens in ferocious schools. Apparitions that attempted to illustrate the mysteries of the astral plane. Seances. Anthropomorphic tangles of impenetrable forests and trees. Luminous sunsets. Modeled turban squashes that bear a striking resemblance to his anatomical themes, questioning the very nature of the words still life. Stubborn, aging bodies, defiant and accepting of the ravages of time, calling to mind not only of the great painters of the past, like Rembrandt and Goya, but also those of the present, like Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon. The story we tell in the galleries here at the MFA, like all stories and like all exhibitions, is shaped and edited. It is not a retrospective, nor was it meant to be one. And we know from both contemporary popular culture, the musical Hamilton, for example, and also from recent current events, that there are different ways to look at things, that separate truths coexist and different voices approach the same story and take away different interpretations. And that's why I'm so pleased today that you will not hear from me, but from a distinguished roster of speakers who have their own views of Bloom's accomplishments and a deep interest in his spiritual journey, among them the authors of the monograph Hyman Bloom, Modern Mystic. Before I introduce them, let me just quote from one of our guests, Holland Cotter, who wrote Bloom's obituary for the New York Times in 2009. And I quote, "Mr. Bloom's art mixed a Baroque exuberance and jewel-like colors. His historic influences ranged from Grunewald and Rembrandt to Redon and Rouault, to Indian tantric art and Chinese painting. His images often fell on the hallucinatory side of visionary and could be called confrontational, even repellent. Synagogue lamps, scintillating with light, translucent spirits evoked in seances, disemboweled bodies on autopsy tables. His paintings were sometimes hard to love, but they are not easily forgotten. Nearly all of his work bound together by a single theme, or rather fueled by a single dynamic, an obsession with the fact of physical mortality transformed into a mood of spiritual delirium. There is no question of its moral seriousness." I'm going to introduce all of our speakers now, all at once, so that we can experience our program seamlessly without the interruptions of an MC. After all, even the Oscars tonight are hostless. I'm going to ask you to hold your questions to the end. We will bring our speakers and presenters up on stage at the end and invite you to ask your questions of us all together. So let me begin. Our first speaker is the distinguished scholar of American art, Henry Adams. Henry is a graduate of Harvard and received his MA and PhD from Yale. He's the author of over 300 scholarly and popular articles, ranging over the American field from the 17th century to the present. Henry has written important books and essays on Thomas Eakins, John Lafarge, Winslow Homer, Grant Wood, Thomas Hart Benton, Jackson Pollock, and Hyman Bloom. He received the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize of the College Art Association in 1985, the first time the prize was ever awarded to an Americanist or to a museum curator. And he has held important curatorial positions at the Carnegie Institute, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, and the Cleveland Museum of Art. Henry has worked on prize-winning documentary films about American art and is a frequent contributor to the magazine Smithsonian. Currently a professor of American art at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Henry's deep scholarship and curiosity are matched by a novelist's skills at telling a story, something that comes out in his wonderful essay about Bloom in Modern Mystic. As many of you know, one of Hyman Bloom's passions was the music of Southeast Asia, and I am delighted to welcome the Mirasi Collective here today for a musical performance. The Mirasi Collective is a collaboration of musicians who innovate in the folk and spiritual music of Pakistan and Northwest India. Their themes are often irreverent and introspective of the larger society around them. Though often used as an insult today, Mirasi refers to groups of wandering musicians going back at least 800 years. These musicians would sing about history, genealogy, and spirituality in ways that were accessible to the common people. Today's performers are Michael Singh on sarangi and Ishwin Dembla on the tabla. Following their performance, we will hear from Marcia Brennan, the Carolyn and Fred McManis Professor of Humanities at Rice University in Houston, where she's also professor of art history and religious studies. Marcia received her BA from Mount Holyoke and her MA and PhD from Brown. Her research is focused upon modern and contemporary art history and museum studies, as well as the medical humanities. She's the author of several books, among them Curating Consciousness, Mysticism and the Modern Museum, Modernism's Masculine Subjects, Matisse, the New York School and Post-Painterly Abstraction, and Painting Gender, Constructing Theory, the Alfred Stieglitz Circle, and American Formalist Aesthetics. The winner of numerous prizes and grants for her scholarly work and also for her teaching, Marcia has served since early 2009 as an artist in residence in the Department of Palliative Care and Rehabilitation Medicine at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, which has influenced her interest in spirituality and in the end of life, the topic of her most recent books, The Heart of the Hereafter, Love Stories from the End of Life, Life at the End of Life, Finding Words Beyond Words, and her current book project arose from two gardens, Sainte-Thérèse of Lisieux and Images of the End of Life. She is also one of the co-authors of Modern Mystic. Our final speaker today is Holland Cotter, the co-chief art critic of the New York Times, where he has been on staff since 1998. He writes on a wide range of art, old and new, with a global perspective and a deep interest in the art of South Asia, China, and Africa. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2009. A fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, Holland grew up in the Boston area, and the MFA was his museum. He earned degrees from Harvard, where he studied English literature with the poet Robert Lowell, from the City University of New York, where he got a master's degree in modern American art, and from Columbia, where he earned an MPhil in early Indian Buddhist art. Not only a lover of art, Holland is also a lover of language. No doubt the reason his pieces in the Times are always the ones I turn to first. In an article about his early inspirations, he singled out a postcard he saw in grade school of Henri Matisse's Blue Window, recalling, and I quote, "The more I looked at the picture, the better I liked it. I liked what I saw as its modesty, its tentativeness, and its otherworldliness. Heaven was blue, wasn't it? I liked that it was furnished with the idea of things rather than with the actual things. I liked its semi-emptiness. I liked that it had stories not yet told. There was room for a writer to be in there." There's room for a lot in looking at art. There's room for writers especially, and for poets and philosophers and musicians and other artists, and for people like you and me who take what we see and use it as a bridge into our own lives, both material and also spiritual. I hope you'll enjoy today's program and the exhibition, which will be on view until February 23rd. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. And it's an honor to take part today in the resurrection of Hyman Bloom, a remarkable painter whose works have a quality that goes beyond mere technique and addresses the great questions of the human condition. A troubling question is why this resurrection has taken so long, but surely it's in part because of the very power and uniqueness of Bloom's work, which doesn't fit easily into our usual stylistic categories. Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning famously termed Bloom the first abstract expressionist, and he was treated in good part as such by two other admirers of his work, Thomas Hess and Elaine de Kooning. But the term somehow feels inadequate to describe the weight and gravitas of Bloom's work, which seems not so much an exercise in artistic style as a probing of the most challenging aspects of the human condition. What strikes me, in fact, is that The terms that best describe Bloom are often seemingly opposite. No painter of the 20th century painted flesh that so insistently directs our attention to its fleshiness and physical substance. Yet no other so transformed flesh into something essentially spiritual and made it seem so commandingly unearthly and transcendent. The exhibition now at the museum particularly stresses his response to the human body and to death and decay, but in fact he's a painter of wide-ranging subject matter, of landscape, still life, and figure paintings of varied types. A sort of modern Odysseus, whose career can be seen as a mystical and spiritual journey, a series of sojourns on different spiritual islands. By way of raising the issues of the most salient qualities of Bloom's work, let me begin by showing a painting recently on view at the Alexander Gallery in New York. Is this realistic or abstract? Ostensibly, this is a landscape, a study of trees, roots, rocks, and earth intertwined with each other. But it also doesn't take much imagination to see this as a sort of rendering of the interior of a human body, with muscles, spine, tendons, nerves, and viscera exposed. More largely, it somehow explores a sort of rhythmic transformation of things, and in some sense, the interwoven forms seem not so much physical things as lines of energy, like electrical waves or ripples on a pool of water, energies that are in some sense abstract. What's intriguing is the way that the landscape is seen as a whole, as the embodiment of a process, a continuous process of transformation, and of some sort of interplay between life force and decay. Surely this painting is not so much a representation of any particular place as an embodiment of a thought about the nature of human existence. To understand what's going on, I think it's helpful to know a little bit about Hyman Bloom's background. Bloom's career is remarkable both for the art he produced and for his life story, and the two interweave with each other in fascinating ways. It's remarkable, in fact, that Bloom ever became an artist at all, since he was born in 1913 in extreme poverty in a Jewish village in Latvia and spent his early years in a house with one room, a dirt floor, a stove in the center for heat, and one bed which served the entire family. Record keeping was so primitive in this stark setting that we don't know for sure the exact date of Bloom's birthday. The notion of time travel has always haunted the human imagination, and I stress this aspect of his origins to suggest that Bloom was not only born in another place and in another culture, but in a profound sense in another time. The world he grew up in was a sort of time warp that preserved intact the rituals and way of life of earlier centuries. The question of what it means to be Jewish is obviously a sensitive matter, but surely a major aspect of this question is that Judaism is the oldest cultural tradition of the Western world, which preserves religious and cultural traditions that go back thousands of years to the very birth of civilization, to the time of the first origins of agriculture. It's a tradition that creates an immediate contact with the ancient past, that uniquely brings with it a sense of the burden of history, and that looks on human suffering and tribulations with a view not simply to today, but to the passage of centuries. Bloom was clearly deeply affected by the religious services he attended in this essentially medieval setting with their colorful ritual and mysterious chanting. We know that when Bloom arrived in the United States in 1920 at the age of 7, his ambition was to become a rabbi. While later in life, Bloom threw away his hat and ceased to attend regular Jewish services, he made paintings of rabbis throughout his career, always had a close circle of Jewish friends, and chose to have a Jewish funeral service and burial. At some level, the role of the rabbi, the seeker of spiritual truth, runs as a continuous, relentless theme through his life as an artist, is indeed the unifying thread of his career. In many ways, his pursuit of spiritual truth is more profoundly linked with the activities of a seer or a shaman than of a painter. When he arrived in America at the age of 7, Bloom and his family settled in the West End of Boston, which was then the main center for Jewish immigration. And it's an area that was entirely destroyed by the urban renewal of the 1960s. Initially, the family lived in quarters that were very crowded, with 8 people packed into a 3-room apartment. Bloom seems to have sought escape from family tensions in school, where he excelled in art from an early age. And this leads one to one of the miraculous moments of Bloom's career. At the age of 13, when he was in the 8th grade, Bloom began to make classes from a very gifted art teacher, Harold Zimmerman. And 3 years later, when he was 16, his talent came to the attention of a professor at Harvard, Denman Ross, the scion of a wealthy Boston Brahmin family. Ross was so impressed by the work of Bloom and another talented young high school student, Jack Levine, that he agreed to subsidize them both. For 4 years, Ross supported Bloom and Levine, paying for their studio space and providing art lessons, both from Zimmerman and some that he provided himself. At the end of that period, when Bloom was just 20, Ross staged an exhibition of their work at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard, a completely unprecedented honor. At the time, the Fogg did not show the work of living artists, but Ross got around this regulation by presenting the display not as an art exhibition, but as an experiment in art education. Bloom's early drawings are very different from what he produced as a mature artist and have an old master quality, very different from his mature work. But in key respects, they laid the foundation for his later achievement. Zimmerman's method stressed figure drawing, but he taught his students to draw entirely from memory and imagination rather than from life. His students first lightly blocked out a composition in delicate outlines and then gradually worked to realize the individual parts. If they were drawing hair, for example, they might study drawings by Durer, Leonardo da Vinci, or Botticelli, then apply their memory of what they had seen to the drawing that they were trying to develop. They were also encouraged to apply their physical awareness of their own body, their muscular memory, to the section of anatomy they were trying to work at. Creating a single drawing by the Zimmerman method might take weeks, but the end result was interestingly different from most academic work. Rather than merely copying visual appearance, it was the expression of feeling and thought. While studying with Zimmerman, Bloom made some quite remarkable figure drawings, such as this one, and their anatomical accuracy is such that it's hard to believe that they were drawn not from life, but entirely from imagination. At the same time, what's striking is they seem to go beyond mere material transcription. Like the drawings of the most notable old masters, such as Michelangelo, they seem to be the expression not only of the physical substance of the human form, but of some mysterious sort of underlying spiritual idea or spiritual struggle. As a sort of foreshadowing of what comes later, I should also note that Ross's activities as a collector suggest spiritual and metaphysical interests. Ross was an admirer of the work of William Blake and an ardent collector of Asian and Indian art. At this point, there's a sort of break in Bloom's career when, until Bloom's work was shown at the Museum of Modern Art and had become the expression of a very different artist. We know that in this interim period, Bloom experienced great poverty, that he often experienced hunger, that he worked both in an unheated studio in Boston and for a time lived in a remote hut on the dunes of Cape Cod, a desert environment strangely similar to that in which the early Christian saints retreated to experience their mystical visions. At this time, Bloom became interested in mystical doctrines of rather varied sort, from the Rosicrucians and the Order of the Portal to the Vedanta and the religions of India. He also became interested in world music, particularly that of India, taught himself to play the sitar, and began collecting recordings of world music. Through a combination of fasting and spiritual retreat, he experienced visionary states, including one in which he felt a new unity with the entirety of nature. Somehow word circulated about his work, and this reached the ears of Dorothy Miller at the Museum of Modern Art. When she visited Bloom's studio in 1941, she found that his paintings were turned to the wall and that he was reluctant to show them to her. Eventually, she persuaded him to turn them around, and with additional coaxing, persuaded him to lend 9 paintings to a show she was organizing. This created something of a sensation when they were shown in New York. While they all had subject matter that gave them a focus, their handling was near abstract. They took themes such as chandeliers and Christmas trees and translated them into a sort of luminous energy. Along with Morris Grave, Bloom's work was singled out by a number of critics as the standout of the exhibition. And among those who saw these paintings were Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, who later termed Bloom the first abstract expressionist. Within a few years, Bloom had moved on to the paintings for which he's probably most celebrated today, images of autopsies and cadavers, which deal with the most grisly imaginable subject matter, but transform dismemberment and decay into something colorful and mysteriously beautiful. And these are quite unforgettable paintings. As we will see, there are notable differences between Bloom's work and that of the abstract expressionists, but there are also definite similarities. Both were clearly breaking through excuse me, the traditional guidelines of academically realistic Western painting to create something more mystical, more expressive, and more visually and intellectually challenging. Equally significant, it's clear that there was an audience in the 1940s for this sort of work, that it was a response to some sort of deep cultural and spiritual need. Clearly, a convergence of factors led to this situation. One was that photography had made purely realistic painting beside the point. Another was that this was a period when the fundamental notion of reality was shifting. Science, which began with concrete, observable fact, increasingly became a scheme of conjectures about a world of mysterious energies and particles which we can't see or experience directly. In an odd way, this brought mankind back to an earlier world of mysticism when people believed that there were invisible spiritual forces that stand behind the world that we can actually see. In some sense, I think what Bloom did was to propose creating a link between ancient spiritual and mystical doctrines, as described in the Vedanta, for example, and the new world of scientific discoveries. His paintings of corpses in a state of dismemberment and decay, for example, are at once records of the physical process of molecular decay and change and transformation, and of a spiritual process of substance being transformed into spirit. Bloom seems to have consciously distanced himself from the abstract expressionists. In his later years, he seems to have focused increasingly on issues of spirituality and expanding consciousness in a way which is strangely in tune with the youth counterculture of the 1960s. He briefly experimented with LSD under the supervision of professors from Harvard. He immersed himself in mystical and philosophical doctrines, particularly those of India. He learned to play the sitar. He became a friend of Ravi Shankar, and he became something of an expert in the field of Indian and world music. Increasingly in the 1960s, Bloom's work was paired with that of I was going to say, interestingly, his work was paired with that of Francis Bacon in an exhibition at UCLA, who's another painting of disturbing themes whose work seems to elude familiar labels. I've suggested that Bloom was a sort of a modern Odysseus on a journey to different spiritual islands, And unfortunately, there's not time to discuss these different islands in detail, but I think that one thing that's impressive is the variety of his work. Chandeliers, Christmas trees, corpses, autopsies, landscapes, archaeological treasures, fish devouring each other, and many others. Many of these themes have iconography and mystical messages that would be interesting to discuss. For example, it seems evident that Bloom's paintings of stones and archaeological treasures are based on the legend of the philosopher's stone, which could turn base metals into gold, and was also an elixir of life, which would bring immortality, enlightenment, and heavenly bliss. And this is certainly the theme of one of his most remarkable paintings, the Eye, which portrayed a stone of this sort as a kind of all-seeing eye, the eye of God, the eye of the universe. A fascinating late moment in Bloom's career occurred around 1960 when he began a series of very large drawings, the earliest of which were inspired by the woods around Lubeck, Maine. Bloom initially intended to work on these drawings for only a few months, but in actual fact, he ended up completely abandoning painting for 10 years to work on drawing alone. And when he returned to painting, he continued to produce large drawings from time to time. From trees, he moved on to seances and strange landscape compositions with weird combinations of rocks, trees, waterfalls, faces and figures, and fish devouring each other, which is a theme based on Hindu sources. The artistic move was a bold one, for the abstract expressionists had specifically disparaged drawing and had insisted that one should not make studies for a painting but work things out directly and spontaneously on the canvas. By focusing so intently on drawing, Bloom was surely consciously distancing himself from the abstract expressionists and probably also showing off the fact that he knew how to draw like an old master, which most of the abstract expressionists did not. Surely there was another impulse as well for a campaign of work which was so prolonged and intense. It seems that Bloom's drawings were exploring a specific theme, the world of the astral plane, the uneasy world between life and death, where the physical world and the spiritual world change into each other. An important aspect of this series is the absence of color, and through eliminating color, Bloom pulls us all the more powerfully into a world of darkness and uncertainty, of twistedness and of tangledness. Unlike most drawings, these are not studies for paintings, but major works in their own right, with the scale and commanding quality of a major oil painting. Indeed, it's hard to think of a major statement in drawing of this sort by any other major 20th century artist. And I might say that one's first impression is that these drawings are highly detailed, but what's interesting when you look at them up closely is the sweeping energy of Bloom's lines and gestures, so that he seems not so much to define the surface of a physical form as patterns of energy or perhaps spiritual waves of some sort that run beneath the surface of physical matter. And you can see when he's sketching things out quickly, it's almost as though his lines are electrical sparks. It's a spiritual view of the world, which is, I think, connected with the mysterious world of modern physics. I think it's clear that Bloom's great theme is transformation of two sorts: the disintegration of things, including the body through decay, and the transformation of physical things into spirit, into light, and into energy. And what I'd like to propose is that to grasp these themes, we need to step a little outside the usual world of art history and think about human culture in larger terms. The fact is that when I personally search for an equivalent to what Bloom was doing in charcoal and paint, what comes first to mind is not other paintings, but literature by some of the great American writers such as Poe and Melville. His art seems to conjure up the world of darkness of Poe, and he seems to be chasing the white whale, rather like Herman Melville. Bloom's contact with Harvard put him in direct communication with the spiritual and literary world of Boston. And in interesting ways, I think Bloom's art grew out of this culture. Boston has had connections with Asia since the days of the China trade, and in the late 19th century, through the efforts of Ernest Fenollosa, William Sturgis Bigelow, and others, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston here built up what is arguably the world's greatest collection of Chinese, Japanese, and Asian art. William Sturgis Bigelow, interestingly, was the first American to take up the study of Zen Buddhism under a Japanese master at a temple in Japan. Two of the curators at the Museum of Fine Arts, Okakura Kakuzo and Ananda Kurumaswamy, are celebrated to this day not only as gifted art historians, but as teachers of the philosophies and mystical doctrines of India and Asia. Unlike any other curators I can think of, they were not only remarkable art historians and curators, but were significant figures in shaping the values of the modern age. In addition, while there's a certain flinty, stingy side to the culture of Boston, perhaps as a sort of reaction against that, there seems to be a mystical idealizing strain evident in New England transcendentalism or even in the teachings of Christian Science. Henry Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson both immersed themselves in Hindu philosophy and the Vedanta. And in a somewhat diluted way, Bloom immersed himself in this school of thinking when he circulated with the faculty at Harvard. Edward Forbes, for example, who was director of the Fogg Art Museum and chair of the art history department, was the grandson of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Denman Ross was a close friend of Okakura Kakuzo and Ananda Kurumaswamy. While much of the Boston world was traditional, there were always also stirrings of modern impulses. And for example, while today we think of the Museum of Modern Art as the creation of New York, the figure who largely created the Museum of Modern Art, Alfred Barr, was a product of Paul Sax's museum class at Harvard. Like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bloom felt that to grasp a process as a whole is to move from a world of physical suffering into one of spirit. In some ways, the best summation of what Bloom expressed in painting is captured in Emerson's essay on the Oversoul, in which he challenged the notion of seeing the world in dualities, rather than in an all-embracing unity in which things like life and death, creation and decay are part of a single, larger process. As Emerson wrote, "We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man as the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are shining parts is the soul." The essence of Ross's teaching, as well as those of Zimmerman, was the notion that art should not simply be a mechanical process, but should become the embodiment of thought and spirit, that every line or brushstroke should be the emanation of an idea. I think what's intriguing about Bloom is that coming from a very different cultural background from the so-called old families of Boston, he picked up this strain of Boston culture and Boston artistic expression and gave it a new inflection. In interesting ways, it connected with his Jewish heritage and his fascination with the role of the rabbi as a seeker of truth and divine insight. In other words, Bloom drew from the environment and culture that surrounded him, and in doing this demonstrated that the intellectual and artistic traditions of Boston and the New England Transcendentalists could be deployed in a way that's not reactionary, but progressive and modern. And let me close with a final thought. Admirable as they are, it seems to me that if we look at the work of abstract expressionists, they look like artifacts of an earlier world and an earlier age. They've become antiques. By contrast, Bloom's work still has a strangely contemporary quality. If Bloom's paintings were exhibited in New York today, it would be easy to take them for the work of a contemporary painter. To a degree that's remarkable for work created half a century ago, they address issues that still seem alive and urgent today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're the Mirasi Collective. We're going to present a few short pieces for you today. I just played what's called an alap. It's the way you usually commence a performance in Hindustani music or the music of India and Pakistan. With me today is Ishwin Dembla on tabla. And I guess to speak to the subject of today, which is Hyman Bloom, very shortly I'll say in Indian classical music, it's very, very technical, and I think a lot of times we find spirituality is very different in our music. And one of the ways that it sees itself through is that in Western music you often have orchestras and a whole group of musicians coming together to make one piece. With Indian classical music, it's oftentimes one musician and one note. Like on this instrument, even though there are plenty of strings, there's really only one note that's being played. but that one note is given so much command and so many acrobatics that it becomes a focal point for the audience and for the mind of the player. And so you enter into this state of some sort of spiritual or temporal awareness and meditation as you play to really get into the real, I guess, way that you would express yourself in our music. What we're going to play for you is a couple of pieces that are Sufi. So from our tradition, these are the wandering mystics, mendicants, who came throughout South Asia. They were Muslims, and this is how Islam, in many ways, traveled through India successfully. They were spiritual people who brought a lot of the native beliefs of the area in line with Islam. And this particular piece is a poem by a Sufi saint called Shah Hussain. And it's about longing for the mother, longing for the supreme, and the pain of separation, but also the delight of reattachment.
दर्द विछोड़ दा हाल नी माए नी मैं किनू आखां माए नी मैं किनू आखां दुखां दी रोटी सूरां दा सालण दुखां दी रोटी सूरां दा सालण आइंदा बालन बालनी दर्द विछोड़े दा हालनी मायनी मैं किनू आखां मायनी मैं किनू आखां
Nothing like a little tuning issue to break your spirituality. One more piece.
Thank you. Let there be light. Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking Edward Schein for this kind and wonderful invitation to participate in the symposium, Robert Alimi for his collegial conversations and his help with visual materials, Stella, Bloom for her generously making available the contents of the artist's sketchbooks and library, Erica Hirschler for her work in assembling this amazing exhibition and symposium, and Kristen Hoskins and Liz Batty for their assistance with the event. Okay. Soon after I started to engage deeply with the research materials for the book project, Hyman Bloom, Modern Mystic, I began to think of Bloom himself as a very special kind of chandelier. Yeah, no, Ed knows. Okay, so this symbol became something of a running joke as I chatted with the core members of the team, with Ed Schein and Bob Alimi, about Bloom's visionary modernist project. And it became a kind of shorthand or a code. I would speak with that. I'm like, yeah, I'm working on the chandelier again. And so the more extensively I engaged with Bloom's artworks, the more vivid the image of the chandelier became as a metaphor for the artist's creative practice and for the distinctive type of spirituality that underpins his contribution to mid-century modernism. And there we are. We're fortunate to have a striking example of an actual Bloom chandelier painting on display in the exhibition, chandelier number 2 of 1945. Okay, so why a chandelier? Because this subject provides a vivid metaphor for envisioning ever-shifting constellations of luminous presences. And that, too, is Bloom. Despite the differences between the subjects that he depicted and the various stylistic modes in which he worked, Bloom's oeuvre can be approached collectively as an intricate configuration of prisms, a conglomeration of dynamic, shifting frameworks that produce a host of luminous perspectives. In this painting, as in so many of Bloom's images, fragments of everyday life become transfigured so that they appear to be radiant. In turn, Bloom's transformational vision creates a sense that viewers are inhabiting an illuminated reality. Thus, the expressive image of the chandelier provides something concrete to hold on to as we examine some of the more subtle and esoteric aspects of the artist's engagement with mystical spirituality. First, it's important to note that Bloom was a voracious reader and a constant explorer. He was fascinated by the study of comparative religion, as well as by various esoteric philosophies and spiritual systems. Notably, Bloom himself did not adopt an orthodox approach to any particular tradition. Instead, he engaged a number of eclectic sources quite broadly, and here's the important part. He found novel ways to make them his own. Each time you look at a painting that has Buddhist-inspired overtones, Hindu-inspired overtones, Orthodox Jewish-inspired overtones, you can only be looking at a Bloom. He found each way as he encountered each of these traditions to make them his own. It's his particular version of the chandelier. It's his composite perspective. So Bloom was born into an Orthodox Jewish family who left their village on the Lithuania-Latvia border to settle in Boston in late 1920. While Bloom made his bar mitzvah, and later he requested a traditional Jewish burial, the artist lived his adult life as a culturally assimilated Jew. At an early point in his career, Bloom painted groundbreaking images of the synagogue. And here I'm showing you an example from 1940, and you can see a chandelier hanging in the background of the painting. As Bloom has noted, he was drawn to what he saw as the ecstatic moments within sacred rituals, particularly here as voiced in the exquisite songs of the cantors. And what you're actually seeing here is the Kol Nidre. And so this is the ceremony that's being performed. In addition, throughout his career, Bloom produced elaborate paintings and drawings of rabbis holding Torah scrolls or being deeply immersed in the contemplation of sacred texts. Extending these themes, the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah also informed Bloom's thinking, but not because the artist self-identified as a Kabbalist in particular. Rather, because this esoteric system figured prominently in the theosophical texts that Bloom engaged so deeply. Just as theosophy represented the great synthesizer of systems, One of the most influential books that Bloom encountered was Madame Helena Blavatsky's multi-volume compilation, The Secret Doctrine, The Synthesis of Science, Religion, and Philosophy. Notably, Bloom read these volumes during the summer of 1939. Blavatsky's hybrid, compendious works provided elaborate conceptual frameworks of esoteric terms and symbols, which she often approached through a comparative perspective. And that, in turn, allowed Bloom to correlate multiple systems of thought, including Kabbalah, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Okay. Bloom was particularly intrigued by the images of the wheel of life and the wheel of existence. He found suggestive thematic resonances between these perennial images and the classical motif of man breaking bonds on the wheel of 1929, which he depicted in an elaborate drawing that's featured in the show. So here you see the image and then a detail below it. For Bloom, the wheel also functioned as a means to express recursive cycles and circular formations of time, of temporality, including in the calendar and in the wheel of the zodiac, imagery that the artist developed extensively in his sketchbooks. And the sketchbooks really are elaborate. They are works of art in and of themselves. When you look at his kinds of calendrical and cylindrical and zodiacal productions and projections, you can see Bloom basically almost inventing his own language. He's engaging with these archetypal forms, these perennial forms. He's making notations, he's seeing parallels. It's in the works on paper that this really becomes striking and extraordinary. In the late 1930s, Bloom visited Boston's Vedanta Center. Vedanta is a form of Hindu philosophy, particularly closely associated with Sri Ramakrishna. In Hinduism, the wheel refers to notions of birth and rebirth, fate and existence, recurrence, as well as the chakras or the spinning wheels of luminous energy embedded within the energetic human body. In turn, in Buddhism, prayer wheels relate to sacred practices in which wheels are spun continuously to engage the blessings of a spiritual being who is thought to be the embodiment of compassion, thereby awakening the spiritually powerful sense of compassion that resides within the higher self of human beings. And this also is really central to Bloom's explorations, this whole idea of an embodied, ever-present sense of compassion. So how does one access that? Through texts, through prayers, through suffering, through reading, and through avatars. And here is one of Bloom's visions of this. Such notions of compassionate avatars or bodhisattvas held considerable appeal for the artist. Bloom painted these transitional figures in theosophically inflected paintings, such as The Medium, which you see here, and Apparition of Danger. These are both great paintings. They date from 1951, and interestingly, they're now both housed in the Hirshhorn collection in Washington, D.C. As was the case for Bloom and others, the study of Eastern religions in America represented a compelling means for exploring contemporary cross-cultural perspectives. These traditions provided ways of approaching notions of compassion and suffering, as well as insight into a phenomenon that scholars refer to as theosis. Okay, that may be an unfamiliar term for people in the audience, so I'll repeat this. I'll even spell it. It's theosis, T-H-E-O, so theo, like God, T-H-E-O-S-I-S. So theosis is the process through which human beings become godlike, as they consciously recognize their own inner divinity. So once again, it's this overarching perennial quest for compassion, exploration, the knowing of oneself and one's own inner divinity, taking that vision that comes inward, translating it outward into pictorial forms. That is part of the greatness of Bloom's painting. Buddhism in particular, and esoteric Buddhism in particular, provided Bloom with an enhanced understanding of related bodhisattva imagery, as these transitional figures of wisdom and compassion manifested as incarnated human-like divinities. And that's what you're seeing here in the golden figure on the right. Okay, the seeds for these spiritual explorations, which were broad and deep, were evident at an early point in Bloom's life. As a young man, the artist read the metaphysical poetry of William Blake, and he engaged the mystical texts of William James and P.D. Ouspensky, particularly the latter's tertium organum, a keys to the enigma of the world. So you're hearing me talk about a lot of esoteric texts that are probably unfamiliar to many of you, but very, very important within the intellectual and cultural history of their day. Bloom also attended meetings at the Boston Society for Psychical Research and at the Order of the Portal, an esoteric group that discussed various occult subjects. These formative experiences provided Bloom with open doorways of thought, as well as with a robust comparative framework for approaching various topics in mysticism and esotericism. Moreover, these experiences provided the young artist with the means to build a community, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to consult specialty libraries, all of which very, very important. This community building, the sense of conversation and exploration. Later in life, Bloom also experimented with spiritualism. He attended seances, and he created elaborate drawings inspired by these mystical subjects. Indeed, mediums provided suggestive motifs for envisioning multiple transitional worlds. So each of these practices that I've just too briefly described and traditions can be seen as constituent elements within Bloom's composite vision, or each one is a kind of individual crystal within his metaphorical chandelier. While all were important, arguably no single experience was as impactful as the mystical experience that Bloom had in 1939. Also, very important, that event followed a period of extended darkness and struggle in the artist's life. And here, Bloom's own words are crucial. As the artist stated, quote, and this is from Bloom, "I had a conviction of immortality, of being part of something permanent and ever-changing, of metamorphosis as the nature of being. Everything was intensely beautiful, and I had a sense of love for life that was greater than I'd ever had before," end quote. Yeah, that quote is super important within the literature on Bloom. And that encounter, also importantly, was accompanied by a sense of dazzling color, as he described it, and that dazzling color transformed Bloom's view of the world around him, a vision that united mortal flesh with a sense of transcendence. As Bloom further observed on these subjects, quote, "Spiritual life cannot be delegated. True spiritual experience can only come from within, and it's only through individual effort to deepen the process that a state of grace can be achieved. Certain kinds of knowledge can only be earned, sometimes through effort and sometimes through suffering," end quote. Again, it's a very beautiful quote, a very moving quote and a difficult quote, like so much within Bloom's career. Let me provide you with another means to envision the ways in which Bloom represented his mystical experience. In addition to the chandeliers, another hallmark image in Bloom's oeuvre is his evocatively titled self-portrait of 1948, a painting that's also featured in this exhibition. When viewed in light of Bloom's description of his mystical experience, self-portrait can be seen as instantiating the ways in which aesthetics can function as the language of epiphanies. I'm going to repeat that phrase, okay? In light of the mystical experience that Bloom had, when you keep in mind his own words and everything that preceded and went into the experience of his painting an important work like this, okay? And then we go and we look at a work like this, it can be seen as embodying, as instantiating, as representing by its own very presence the ways in which aesthetics, art forms, symbolic forms, thought forms, the ways in which aesthetics can function as a language of epiphanies, insights, radical insights. In this numinous corporeal image, Bloom presents an alternative anatomical display as flayed human flesh converges with the prismatic spectral body to produce a configuration of colored light. He's retranslating, he's reverse engineering, he's redepicting, right, what he's describing in that mystical experience. These physical and metaphysical themes are consistent not only with Bloom's experience, but, and this is also so interesting, with his practice of attending the actual dissection of cadavers in hospital morgues and anatomy labs. And here you see Bloom's contemporary painting, Female Corpse, Back View of 1947. It's a great painting. It's not only featured in this exhibition, but it's part of the permanent collection of this museum, and it's a wonderful Lane collection piece, and that's such an important collection here in this museum. Indeed, Bloom's groundbreaking autopsy and dissection images represent the focus of this exhibition, Hyman Bloom, Matters of Life and Death. Throughout these pieces, Bloom's visionary modernism appears within an artistically progressive, abstracted framework of human figuration. The result, if we were to use art historical language, like what kind of painting are we dealing with here, where would we locate this in the canon, what would we call this? Well, I would call this the result, which is a kind of expressive form of mystical humanism. And there's too much to say about that. This is a hit and run. I'm giving you the term. What that even means in mid-century modernism with all that's going on and all that's about to happen, it's mystical humanism. It's got its own kind of place within canonical American modernism. Okay, for all of these reasons, the works are remarkable, but not least so because they feature highly stylized, abstracted images of the anatomical forms that Bloom encountered in an actual clinical context. He's retranslating, he's redescribing, right? He's carrying from one to another, one domain to another. In so doing, the paintings engage a series of ritual boundary crossings, just as they present transgressive and otherwise unseen subjects through a language of iridescent, translucent forms. When you look at both of these images, as different and as similar as they are, just look at how the energy bounces back and forth. The images appear to be at once real and otherworldly. They're figural and they're abstract. They're bodies and they're not bodies. They're individuals and they're typological collective presences. So what I'm saying, in short, is that Bloom is having it both ways as he moves beyond conventional dualistic categories. The logic that underpins the images is at once mystical and non-dual. They're more than one thing at once. They are in multiple places simultaneously. This is a hallmark of mysticism. A mystic is a person who can occupy multiple locations simultaneously. That's partly what I'm hoping to walk you through as I'm describing the paintings in this way. The anatomical images both violently and gracefully incorporate the two sides of being. In these works, Bloom is painting subjects that are coming into form and that are going out of form simultaneously. So he's painting the creation that is the destruction that is the creation. All of which is to say that in these works, Bloom can be seen as painting mysticism itself. When viewed in this light, Bloom is not painting about mysticism, he's painting mysticism. That's both eye-opening and mind-blowing. Once again, the artist's own words are significant. As Bloom observed of his encounters in the anatomy lab, okay, so he's in the anatomy lab, it's as close, it's as grisly, it's as real, it's as visceral as you can get, and here's what he has to say, quote, "On the one hand, it was harrowing. On the other, it was beautiful, iridescent and pearly. It opened up avenues for feelings not yet gelled. It had a liberating effect. I felt something inside that I could express through color. As a subject, it could synthesize things for me. The paradox of the harrowing and the beautiful could be brought into unity," end quote. Just as he engaged this paradoxical language of the harrowing and the beautiful, Bloom adopted a non-dual perspective as he recalled his encounters with the vicissitudes of death and life itself. Not surprisingly, the anatomical works in particular were controversial historically and culturally. As a result, the artist repeatedly found himself in the position of defending the motives underlying his engagement with these very difficult subjects, but yet while simultaneously encouraging viewers to look beyond their conventional difficulties. In an April 1954 interview in Time magazine, Bloom observed of these challenging pieces, quote, "It seems to me that if you have any conviction of immortality, you can look at such a subject as objectively as at anything else. The body is very beautiful, and its insides are just as beautiful as the outside," end quote. In short, as Bloom fused his composite mystical vision with his innovative modernist artistic practice, he deeply explored the premise that ultimately there is nothing that cannot be seen and no place where vision cannot go. Now, this does not mean that these complex artworks are easy to understand or easy to look at. They're not. Sometimes when we encounter Bloom's monumental canvases, the light comes into our eyes so strongly that we almost cannot see. It's a bit like looking directly into a chandelier and trying to sustain our gaze amidst an abundance of shifting light. Yet Bloom found this light within the darkest of places, so that creation and destruction became fused within an ongoing dynamic of expressive transformation. Again and again, Bloom shows us the shattering that is the creation, the release that produces displays of otherwise hidden light. Or, to phrase these mystical insights another way, as we look at paintings as different and as similar as the chandelier and the self-portrait, a shared question arises, namely, how do we see, know, understand, and find language for the part of humanity that encompasses and transcends the forms of the physical body? If you take away nothing else from this talk today, this is the question and the insight I'd like you to have. So again, I'm going to repeat this, just so that you all have this, because I realize this is not easy to take in. This is a lot and it's difficult, and I understand that. Bloom's paintings provide one remarkable response to this question. How do we see, know, understand, and find language for the part of humanity that both encompasses and transcends the forms of the physical body? As the artist himself recognized, both trauma and grace can serve as powerful tools for cultivating an expanded perspective on the relations between humanity and spirituality. And that is the subject of our symposium today, Hyman Bloom, Spirituality and Art. So I'm going to conclude by emphasizing that Bloom occupies a singular position within the history of modern art, and this is part of his greatness, and I'm so happy to be able to say that here in this auditorium at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, so I'll say it again, this is all part of his greatness. Again and again, his works display a dynamic of facing death and seeing life. Remarkable, right? The artist approaches these ultimate subjects in a unique way. Not only is he a treasure finder, but he's someone who makes the treasures visible for all of us to see. The Boston show, Hyman Bloom, Matters of Life and Death, the accompanying catalog, and then the monograph, Modern Mystic, The Art of Hyman Bloom, invite all of us to consider not only Bloom's unique artistic career, but larger collective themes concerning visibility as they unfolded culturally and structurally, historically and presently, visually and spiritually. Bloom's works repeatedly ask us to consider what it takes to make something visible that would otherwise remain unseen. This exhibition, the catalog, and the monograph allow Bloom's works to be seen collectively and to be seen in new ways. In short, these subjects represent nothing less than an extended meditation on how vision can inspire vision. And that, too, is appropriate because it represents the core of Bloom's mystical vision as well. Thank you.
Hear me okay? It's been wonderful to hear Henry Adams and Marcia Brennan on Hyman Bloom, and to hear these wonderful musicians. I love that music. What I have to add, excuse me, is really just a personal addendum and the furthest thing from a scholarly text. Also, I have no pictures to show you. But as compensation, I'll keep my remarks short, or shortish. My approach here is, as I say, a personal one, which is somewhat paradoxical, as I never met Hyman Bloom in person, aside from a telephone conversation sometime in around 1990, when I was researching an article on his work for Art in America magazine. And although I grew up in and around Boston and went to college here, I did not know of his art until I was writing this piece. I could have seen a lot of his work earlier at the Boston Institute of Modern Art, now the Institute of Contemporary Art, in a 1954 show, except that I was only 7 years old at that time, which didn't preclude my going there. My parents would go to many things and take me with them, but I didn't see it. Or I could have seen his work at the Swetshof Gallery in 1965, except I was at that time incarcerated in a boarding school. And I might have seen a traveling show of his extraordinary drawings at the Boston University Museum in 1968 when I was in college. But I was caught up at that time in the social, political, and chemical turbulence of that day. And I was missing many important, quieter things. I really wish I had seen that show. I know it would have made deep sense to me. So it was with a Manhattan Gallery exhibition called Hyman Bloom, Overview, 1940 to 1990, at Terry Dintenfass Gallery on 57th Street, that I was finally introduced to Bloom's art, and in fairly representative form. The show was basically a mini retrospective of 16 paintings. It included themes that were familiar from what we've seen today: autopsy paintings, apocalyptic landscapes, images of swarming fish in a feeding frenzy, vegetable still lives, and still lives of lusterware vessels, and images of rabbis. Images that were magisterially executed, and despite their apparent differences in subject, related in meaning and in mood. In fact, Art in America had asked me to write the article about two artists, Bloom and Jack Levine, who was also having a New York solo at the same time as Bloom was. A pair of Boston boys is what the editors put it to me. But one look at Bloom's exhibition, and I said, no way. This was an artist of exceptional standalone interest, and one to whom I felt, even knowing only the rudiments of his biography, a strong personal connection. When I learned more and saw more, the connection grew. Actually, it did matter that Bloom was a Boston boy, because I was one too. I grew up in the suburbs, but was in the city constantly with my parents, and I was at the MFA a lot, wandering around, mostly by myself, since the age of 10. Bloom was a regular here too, beginning in his teens, maybe even earlier, when he was taking art lessons on site. That meant that he too must have wandered the galleries and must have been looking at, although this was decades apart, the same things I was looking at, or at least some of them. For sure, he spent time in the Asian collections, one of the greatest in any Western museum, a distinguishing institutional treasure that the MFA should promote as such. Bloom certainly understood its value. We know, because he said so, that his fantastic landscape drawings of the 1960s and 1970s, of which we've seen some examples today, were inspired in part by classical Chinese ink paintings, of which the MA and the MFA has superb examples. His early mentor and teacher, Denman Waldo Ross, an avid collector who was also a museum trustee, I believe, gave some of those paintings to the museum, along with major examples of Indian sculpture and painting, which I assumed played a significant role in Bloom's developing interest in South Asian culture, including Vedanta, spirituality, and Indian classical music. The same collections had a formative influence, intellectual and emotional, on me. And eventually, actually, when I that one conversation I had with Hyman Bloom, one of the things, I was a graduate student at Columbia in South Asian Studies at the time, specifically Buddhist art, and I wanted to talk to him about that, and I did. I was very glad to. In 1974, Bloom made his first trip to India. In 1984, 10 years later, I made my first trip to India. His was technically a music pilgrimage. He was recording and collecting recordings of Indian music while he was there. Mine was an art pilgrimage. In both cases, pilgrimage is the operative word. I think it is not too much to say that for both of us, our Indian trips had a spiritual component, even motivation, though one that wasn't attached to a specific practice or belief. The artist Louis Bourgeois once said, "I don't believe in God, but I have a religious temperament." I don't know what Bloom's thoughts were about a higher power or powers, but I do think he had a religious temperament. He was, by nature, a seeker and a seer, and from a very young age. In 1939, and I will repeat a quote that Marcia gave us, in 1939, when he was 26, he experienced an epiphanic moment that some might call mystical. I had a conviction of immortality, at being part of something permanent and ever-changing, of metamorphosis as the nature of being. Everything was intensely beautiful, and I had a sense of love for life that was greater than I had ever had before. Some years later, in 1955, possibly in the hopes of recapturing that sense of breakthrough, Bloom experimented under controlled psychiatric conditions with taking LSD. This was a year after he had read, hot off the press, Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, that the title being taken from William Blake, who was an early and great hero of Hyman Bloom, thanks to his teacher, Harold Zimmerman. And in this book, the English writer describes his own experiments with mescaline, a hallucinogenic reputed to produce mystical experiences. I haven't read an account by Bloom of his LSD trip, but since it included lunch at the Ritz-Carlton, I assumed it was a positive one. In the 1960s, while in college, I took both mescaline and LSD and did so in something like Bloom's inquiring spirit. The goal wasn't recreation, having fun. It was a quest for revelation and for self-revelation. We could be very serious people in those days. It's amazing. My own experiments were unsupervised and more extended than Bloom's, but they were alternately euphoric and nightmarish. For me, the ever-changingness that for Bloom at 26 felt benign, to me felt threatening in the extreme. I mention all this because when I first saw his work in that exhibition at Terry Dinton Fest Galleries, I flashed on these images that I had when I was taking acid and mescaline. These repeated images of organic matter glowing with material beauty, yet repellent with disintegration. I'd never seen modern paintings that so completely captured this dynamic. I've never seen older paintings, well, some, but not in this culture, that capture that dynamic. So I identified immediately with these paintings of his from my own experience. A final factor I want to mention in speaking of my sense of identification with Hyman Bloom and his art has to do with his most controversial and memorable subject, the human body as a cadaver under autopsy. Autopsies as he witnessed them for the first time at a Boston hospital in 1943. As a teenager, during summers in high school, I worked as an emergency room orderly in an urban community hospital. Because the hospital was the only one in the city, its emergency room really jumped. We got playground injuries and suicide attempts, dog bites and heart attacks, premature deliveries, and middle-of-the-night homicides. People came in dead and were brought back to life. People came in alive and died right there. I took patients up to the wards. I took bodies down to the morgue. Part of my job was to prepare bodies for post-mortem examination, to stand by to assist while an autopsy was in progress, and to clean up afterward. For me, this was a hugely impactful experience on many levels. It had a lasting effect on me, just as Bloom's autopsy attendants, early in his career, had by his own reckoning a major effect on him. In my case, as a budding writer, and a budding writer about art, it clarified an affinity that I was already coming to feel for art that is forthright in dealing in elemental ways with life and death. This included Buddhist tantric art, medieval Christian art, Native American shaman art, popular religious art from Latin America, African sculpture packed with spiritual medicines, contemporary art that would emerge from the AIDS epidemic to come, and the art of Hyman Bloom when I finally saw it. For Bloom, the experience of attending autopsies, which many artists before him had done, seems to have inspired a sense of spiritual resolution similar to what he had felt in 1936. And it produced an art gorgeous and repellent that was impossible to slot into any available marketing category. People tried to label his work expressionism, abstract expressionism, symbolism, Jewish art, spiritual art, but nothing really worked. No label was accurate. No label was enough. De Kooning and Pollock are often cited as having anointed Bloom as the first American abstract expressionist. But his work wasn't abstract. I'm not sure I really think of it as American. And its goal wasn't personal expression. Bloom is an artist of spiritual metaphors, not psychic diary entries. Plus, I think abstract expressionism is overrated, so it's not that great. Despite the fact he came on the scene and had his biggest public successes in the 1940s and 50s, I don't really, in my mind, associate his art with that time. I'm echoing, actually, what Henry said. I think of it as countercultural in the 60s sense, a resistance to an established order, certainly to the anti-spiritual in art order that gained dominance from the 1960s onward in academic circles. And I think of it as multicultural in the present sense, an art that synthesizes global influences to create something brand new, not seen before. There've been, I've noted over the years since that there have been many exhibitions that I wish Hyman Bloom had been able to see, particularly in the 1990s. There was a time when museums, mostly small museums, were introducing live religious practices into exhibition spaces. The Museum for African Art did it with a show called Face of the Gods in 1993, in which it was a show about Afro-Caribbean altars. And part of it was historical altars they borrowed from museums. Then they recreated some altars as natural history museum type dioramas. Then they commissioned some spiritual practitioners, candomblé priests, for example, to create altars in the museum. And the priest said, okay, we'll do that, but on the condition that these will be live altars. We're going to consecrate them. And when it comes down to when the show's over, we're going to deconsecrate them. So the museum very nervously said, okay. And what happened was the altars were consecrated and an entirely different population of viewers came to the museums than had ever been there before. They came from New Jersey, they came from the Bronx, they came to worship at the altars because they'd heard, they got the word, oh, these are going to be there. And so they were leaving offerings there, they were singing. It was amazing, amazing museum experience. And I think Hyman Bloom would have loved that experience. In the same period, Newark Museum did a puja show. And they installed an altar there and did puja in the museum. Plus, Newark's already got a live altar. The Dalai Lama consecrates its Tibetan altar every 10 years. So there was, and there was a show called A Saint in the City, Urban Arts of Senegal. And it was devoted to a single Sufi saint. His name is Sheikh Amadou Bamba. And his image is all over Dakar. And that too brought in, it was done at UCLA, and then it never came to New York or Boston. And that too brought worshipers in from all over to enjoy that show in a very different way from just looking at the images. And I'm going to go, actually this spring, I'm going to go to Senegal and to Touba, the holy city, Touba, and to visit Amadou Bamba's tomb and to spend some time there. Okay, enough of that. But I think all I'm saying is that that vogue for that kind of show ended. We don't do those shows anymore for some reason. I think they just became too unmanageable for museums to deal with. But they were, Hyman Bloom would have liked those shows, just as he would have loved this music today. Okay, so the art market has, numerically speaking, grown almost incomprehensibly vast since Bloom, who is steeped in Vedanta and theosophy, psychic ecstasy, and existential dread, came on the scene some 80 years ago. The present art is a production line, much of it, is a production line industry offering seasonal supplies of slightly tweaked art fair lookalikes, which sell well, at least for a while. But no art, past or present, looks like Hyman Bloom's. And he is a solitary wonder. His apartness continues to be a liability to his placement in art history. But it is a great, great blessing for us all. Thank you.
For those of you who are able to stay, the speakers will join me on stage, and you're welcome to ask each and every one of us questions or to get involved in a discussion. Thank you. And I want to thank all of our speakers for amazing presentations.
Check, check.
Sure.
To Marcia, but I'd love it if any of you had comments. Marcia, would you consider Hyman Bloom's paintings as icons?
Thank you for the question. It's a really wonderful question. The question is, could Bloom's paintings be considered icons? Can they be seen in that way? So I'm going to give you an answer that's almost a Bloomian answer, and I'm going to say yes and no. And so let me do that, right? It's the two-step here. Yes, what makes for an icon, right? The icon is the image. So literally, I-K-O-N, if we look at the root of the word and what it means. And so as far as an image that is set for potentially for veneration, for contemplation, for meditation, reflection, absolutely. The paintings are iconic. Even when you look at really abstract works, you can usually find something in Bloom's catalog that would be a reference point so that you can still kind of locate it one way or another within the natural world. And so there's a way in. At the same time, I would say it's an icon that dissolves its own iconicity. And so, right, and so what I mean by that is that just as you're looking at those forms and just as they're there, you can also see them start to dissolve. You can also see them start to metamorphosize, I think, and that's part of his formal style. I went through the gallery really carefully, and I just kept seeing that again and again. And they do it in the drawings in a very different way, actually, and the works on paper is another really interesting conversation, but particularly in the paintings. So I would say yes and no and yes again.
Hi, I'm over here. I could stand up. Hi, I'm involved in a new art center in Hudson, New York, which is dedicated to art and spirit. Just opened in December. 10 years ago, we couldn't have done this because art and spirit weren't used in the same sentence. A lot of you have talked about the culture and the culture of art and the common culture. I'm wondering what you think our current culture needs from our current artists, and how might you envision our current culture making that possible?
This is sort of a roundabout answer to that, but I think it's interesting that, how would I say, Bloom's career, his work was appreciated in his lifetime. I might say that one of the surprises about writing about Bloom, usually if you have a neglected artist, it's because people have written very badly about them. A lot of remarkable people wrote about Bloom, from Sidney Friedberg, Elaine de Kooning, John Updike, Robert Lowell thought he was the best living painter in America. Nonetheless, it's interesting how it seems as though Bloom's moment is now in some way, that his work seems contemporary in a way that abstract expressionism doesn't quite seem contemporary anymore, and frankly, it's hard for contemporary artists to think of a way to sort of grasp the present moment. So, yeah, whatever it is. And I guess I'd say what's peculiar about Bloom is I think he's a very mystical painter, but he's also someone who is very scientifically informed. He knew a lot about anatomy, and he knew a lot about things like physics and astronomy. So he's really he's an intellectually fascinating figure in a way that is pretty unusual. Sometimes you have people who are very good painters but are not, it's hard to translate that into intellectual issues, and Bloom is a genuine intellectual who also was a great painter.
And if I may just add something to that, I think we live in an age that's just posing enormous challenges, I mean, on many, many levels. And so what are those challenges? Environmental concerns being one. Even, and Ed and I have spoken about this, the isolation of the humanities from other domains of discourse. And so when you do that, when you've got a culture that's privileging STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, when it's privileging those kinds of instrumental technologies and technical conversations, if there's not a seat at the table for the arts and the humanities, what is not represented? Whole questions of ethics, whole questions of humanism, whole questions of how do we identify what's precious in the present enough to protect it, right? So I think that as far as thinking ahead for a role for contemporary arts and the work that the arts can do in making visible subjects that are almost too visible, hyper-visible, cataclysmic, catastrophic, posing challenges, but also almost impossible to represent, art can maybe be that kind of connective tissue.
I have a question for the panel. In 1960, Hyman Bloom stopped painting with color, and he spent 10 years where he drew. And I assume that he was involved in the astral plane in that period, vis-a-vis the 8 drawings that were done of the astral plane between 1965 and 1969. So my question for the panel, and this is just speculation if you're willing, is in 1968, he lost Durlacher as his dealer. Durlacher Kirkaskew closed the gallery, and also Hyman Swetzoff, his Boston dealer, who I think most understood Bloom and was a great dealer. Edith Halpert wanted him to move to New York and take over her gallery. He passed away in 1968. So I wondered if any of you think there is any connection between 1968 and then beginning in 1970, he goes back to painting, the Lubeck paintings and the fish paintings. I don't know. That's it.
I guess I'd say that, yes, there's an element of career setback that I think what's interesting about really creative people is that they turn setbacks into opportunities, and I think that Bloom took this career setback as an opportunity to think about things more deeply and to move back into himself. And I'd have to say, I think that a body of work that deserves a lot more attention are Bloom's drawings. And last time I visited Stella, I spent the better part of the day going through these large drawings that are rolled up in the attic. And there's a whole extraordinary body of work that has never been published or exhibited. And, you know, I see that as a, how would I say, I think this show is a wonderful first step for rediscovering Bloom, but I think that there's a lot more to discover and say about Hyman Bloom.
And I'll just add to take Ed's question as well. It's so interesting, that time period, right? Because what's happening in the 1960s, it's an era of rapid change, right? Social, cultural change. It's revolutionary. And so just as all of these events are describing, existential, biographical, et cetera, the happenstance, what's happening too is he's living through this period of change as everyone else is, and he's changing his painting style. He's giving it up. He's doing the drawings. They're monochromatic. The other piece on this, Ed, is that, everyone, not just Ed, for everyone here, in the late 60s, early 70s, modernism itself, I think, is in its last moments of confidence as a paradigm. And what's happening, right, late 70s, 80s, postmodernism, boom, hits. And so it's that pivotal moment, it's that transitional moment. You can't still paint like it's 1945. You can't still paint like it's 1955. There's that withdrawal. There are the politics in the art world. There are all the changes that you're describing. There are the cultural changes. The paradigm itself, right, stylistically, culturally, is shifting from the modern to the postmodern. So what does he do? He pivots in the opposite way. He's almost contrarian in that way. While you've got the psychedelic 60s, he goes monochromatic. And then it's not until the 70s that he goes colorful again. And that's really interesting because that's when modernism's crumbling, if we're going to look at this canonically.
We have time for one more.
I might just add to that, though. One of the things I find amusing about Bloom is that at the time he turns away from abstract expressionism, he does it in a way that in many ways is similar to the youth culture of the 1960s. In some weird way, he's both against the time but with the time. And you know, that's the aspect of him. There's this curious quality of being a seer to Bloom, but he seems to pick up vibrations that other people aren't picking up.
For anyone who's willing on the panel, I appreciated that Holland Cotter ended with giving us sort of his personal relationship to the work and the artist. I'd love to hear anyone else who could tell us sort of how you first encountered either the artist or his work, or both.
I'll answer that, but I'll also say that I think Tim Phillips has a question and he should be allowed to ask it. So you got it. Okay, you're on it. Okay, I first encountered Bloom's works while I was a graduate student studying art history at Brown, and so our advisor, the great Professor Kermit Champa, had everyone, of course, go to New York, and of course, if you're in New York, it's the Met, and then it's MoMA, and then it's MoMA, and it's back to the Met. So I first saw Bloom's works in the galleries at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
Oddly, I first saw the work of Hyman Bloom when I was in high school, and for some reason I was in Boston with my father, and he had somehow heard about an exhibition of Hyman Bloom, the tree drawings, and I remember being quite impressed by them, but it just sort of, you know, at that point it disappeared from my memory, and I got involved in this project largely through the enthusiasm of Ed Shine, who's sitting in the front row here. I've got to confess, I thought it would be really stimulating and interesting. I thought that Ed was a little bit out of his mind for being quite so enthusiastic about Hyman Bloom, and I think that after this project, we both feel that that Bloom is much more interesting than that he was really. He was very restrained in his enthusiasm when he started off, and both of us think of Bloom as a much more fascinating and deep artist, someone with real depth and gravitas.
So I first encountered Bloom's work when I was an intern here at the Museum of Fine Arts when we did an exhibition of the collection of William and Sandra Lane. And I had my first visit to the Lane's house, and the skeleton painting that's in the exhibition was hanging over the mantelpiece in the Lane's living room. And as I said to Holland at lunch, as a former medievalist, that skeleton picture absolutely stunned and amazed and intrigued me, and I loved it because it said so much to me that I had learned in my studies about medieval art. I met Hyman Bloom some years later when I went with a colleague to the studio, and I had the same experience that most visitors to Hyman Bloom studios had, which is most of the work was turned to the wall, and he didn't really want to show it to anyone and felt that individual works weren't finished. He wasn't done with them yet. He worked on things over time. And it was thanks to Stella that I saw anything that day.
Thank you very much. I was thinking about what Holland said about when you saw the Hyman Bloom paintings in New York in 1990, that you immediately connected because of your own experiences with mushrooms and others. And I've always wondered, when I first saw a Hyman Bloom painting, it was the autopsy painting here when the new wing opened 10 years ago. And I was standing next to a couple, and all they could see was decaying flesh. And I saw a beautiful painting that transcended. And I'm wondering if part of the limit for Hyman, even today, as in the past, is not just what the market says, but people's capacity to see beyond what they may not just do in their daily lives, which is the transcendent. And I think all of you said beautifully that he does that in a way that is unique, truly unique. And I just wonder, how do you help a viewer? Or is it up to the viewer's own sort of metamorphosis or sort of internal journey to be able to see in these paintings what Hyman wanted people to see?
I think it's difficult to convey that. I mean, my own, by the time I came to Hyman Bloom's paintings, I had, as I mentioned, studied South Asian art quite a bit, and so I understood this duality of something that looks bad but is actually good, and it's a hard bit of cultural education to put across, I think. Unless you have some familiarity with it. But, you can call on other religions, you can call on Christianity, you can say, well, what do you think about Isenheim altarpiece, a crucifixion, which is a horrific image, basically. But it's also a salvational image. And maybe just test people out on knowledge they already have about this duality and see if that can connect up for them. That's how I would do it, I think. Yeah.
I'd have to say that I think it's the toughness of Bloom's work that makes it so relevant today. And I mean, I think the abstract expressionists are fine, but compared to Bloom, they seem a bit wimpy. They're sort of not really coming to terms with the big issues of existence and human mortality. And it seems as though Bloom is doing that in a way that does have this extraordinary toughness to it, but that is also transcendent. It's taking a larger view of that. And I think that's the power of his work for us today.
I think that death is the capital fear of most, if not many, if not most people. And so how do we have a cultural conversation on that, right? And so that's an issue. I think that some people will not be able to go there at this time. I think others will want to and not know how to, and then others gravitate toward that naturally. So I think it's a mixed audience. What do? You have exhibitions like the wonderful exhibition that's here. You have books, you publish in the ways that very distinguished people here are doing that, and you teach, right? And many of us are teachers. And so how to integrate these questions and translate them in so many ways such that they have the greatest possibility of reaching their target. And that's really almost a kind of custom education. So depending on where you are, what college or university, who your readership is, who your audience are, all of these variables, you just find a way to meet them where they are. And those who want to know more will come along with you. And those who aren't able to do that, then today's not the day for that.
I also mentioned, I think a point of comparison might be the AIDS epidemic and the art that came out of the AIDS epidemic, because some of that was very grim looking, but in fact it was it came out of a great place of great sympathy and empathy, and I think direct people to some of that work, which deserves to be seen anyway, is underseen. So that might be one.
One last question right here.
I have a question and also an invitation. So I'll give you the invitation first. For those of you who would like to see where Hyman began his life in the West End of Boston, his parents worshipped at the Vilna Shul, which is now Boston Center for Jewish Culture on Beacon Hill. So you're welcome to come and see the names on the walls of the shul. My question is, what do you think Hyman's legacy will be? How will he inspire artists going forward?
I think that it's so important that his works are seen. So again, to get as many people in to see them. And it's the knowledge, it's the visibility, having the book out, right? Just to have the monograph with high quality reproductions, super important. Because if the works can't be seen, I don't think what Bloom was trying to say or express can be seen. So for that, I think that people will read and draw and think selectively, as they always do. There's so much to be seen. I guess that's the question. What is it? Which part of all? There's almost too much. It's the embarrassment of riches in this. So I think the interesting thing will be to see what people coming up are interested in and what aspect of it they identify with. And that's where the teaching comes in. You ask the students, within all of this, you guys, what is it that matters for you? And then you listen closely to what they have to say.
I also think it's important to contextualize him within the range of contemporary art now, or in the very recent past, so that people put him with, as we were saying at dinner with lunch with Paul Tech and a variety of other contemporary artists who young people are looking at and learning from. And if you just put Hyman in there with them, it will illuminate him for these people who don't know him well. So I think that would be one way to do it. Even more important maybe than a single individual show would be to have him, spread around.
I just said that I see his work as a pathway into a lot of different interests, and I think there are whole areas of Bloom that deserve more study. I mean, for one thing, I think that his interest in Indian music is really, that's a whole saga in itself. And I see Bloom's work, and sort of paradoxically, looking at his work as a pathway into mysticism, but also into science, into things like the world of subatomic particles and that kind of thing. He's really, I see him as a figure who leads in many different ways.
I'm just going to wrap things up by thanking you all for coming. It's been an amazing day, and the fact that we filled this room, I think, is a remarkable testament to the artist, and I want each and every one of you to go out and then spread the word, because I think Holland is right. Bloom's work needs to be seen in lots of different contexts and seen by lots of different people, and I think it has a great lesson of empathy and complication and spiritual value to share that's really important right now. Thank you for coming.